If you're a Canon cinema camera shooter, then this year's Christmas came with a bit of an unexpected gift. On December 19th, Canon released new firmware for all of their current cinema cameras, including the R5C. Now, all told, looking at the R5C's changelog, there are 10 items in it. Although the headline feature for many is certainly going to be the removal of restrictions when shooting with the LP-E6P battery. So with that said, let's dig into the new firmware and the features and talk a little bit about what's happened. Now, the headline feature for this firmware update is easily the removal of all limitations when using the LP-E6P battery. This means that the camera now has full autofocus and multifunction shoot power when shooting in 8K RAW LT at 60 frames per second or any of the other previously restricted modes without external power. Now, that said, keep in mind that while this does mean we can build a compact 8K 60 rig without having to figure out how to mount an external battery to it, battery life is still going to be limited. And generally speaking, and looking at battery life, my previous testing at 24 frames per second at 2K and 4K resolutions back in September saw about a 40 to 50% increase in recording time with the new battery, the E6P, versus the old battery. With the current firmware, I am seeing the same estimated recording times of around 80 to 90 minutes at 2K24 with HEVC compression, which again matches what I saw previously, and around 55 minutes with 8K 60 in RAW LT. So a good improvement, but the biggest change there is obviously that the new battery allows unlimited use or not unlimited recording options in terms of functionality. Now, that said, if, like me, you're not an 8K 60 shooter, then there are still some fairly nice features to be found in this update. Topping my personal list of the update features are 2 updates for the UI for interacting with the autofocus system. First of these is a new feature called Tracking by Touch Priority, and you'll find this on the Camera Setup 5 menu page. When enabled, you can now touch what you want the camera's autofocus system to track by touching the LCD in a way that's basically the same as what we have on consumer cameras like the R5 or even the R1. Now, that said, this is not an upgrade to the underlying autofocus system. It is only an upgrade to the user interface. And while it does make it much faster to select things for the camera to track, tracking performance is still essentially the same as it has been in previous firmware. Now, when tracking by touch priority is enabled, the camera indicates this in the level 1 display overlay, that's the one with the most icons, with a small icon here. Also, though not mentioned in the release notes, there is also a new button function to toggle touch by tracking or tracking by touch priority on and off as needed without having to go through the menus. Now, if you're wondering why you might want to turn it on and off rapidly, well, that has to do with the other new feature that the R5C's autofocus user interface has gotten, the ability to drag the AF frame or focus guide to position it in the frame. Now, previously, we could, of course, just touch the screen to move the AF frame, and the AF frame would move where we touched the screen. And that was fine, except there was no option for fine positioning if it didn't fall exactly where you wanted it, aside from basically using the joystick to move it into the final position. However, now we can drag the frame around for the fine positioning in much the same way that, again, we can on an R5 or its siblings. Now, that said, as I already mentioned, this isn't compatible with the touch to track priority mode. When touch to track is enabled, the camera will not slide the AF frame along with your finger when you drag. And that's the primary reason you might want to have a button to toggle touch to track on and off. Now, the final major feature update, I guess you could call it major feature update, was made to the digital image stabilization system. Now, admittedly, I don't really use digital IS, so I'm not terribly well versed in its nuances. However, Canon has added a new setting, motion vectors for digital IS, along with the other digital image stabilization settings found on page 7 of the camera setup menu. Now, based on the description in the release notes and what the manual says about this, When this is enabled, the camera uses both the camera's accelerometer data as well as motion estimation information that's derived from the video frames themselves to stabilize the image. Now, the addition of motion vector information is supposed to significantly improve the performance of digital image stabilization. However, it does come with a catch. Subjects that move a lot in the frame can confuse the motion vector estimates, causing the camera to essentially overcorrect, in effect, adding shake instead of removing it. Now, unfortunately, I haven't tested this to any extent yet, either to see how much better it is or to what kind of conditions can cause problems. But on that note, I have added this to my to-do list for early next year, so I should have something coming on that in a little more detail in maybe about a month or two. Now, in any case, as always with new features like this, I recommend testing it extensively in similar situations to how you might use it before deploying this to your production workflow. In addition to what I consider major updates, Canon has made a number of more minor UI updates as well. Arguably, the biggest of these has to do with clean HDMI output so that you can record things, and the peripheral borders that the in-camera displays use. The release note for this simply reads, adds the ability to apply full screen display to an external display according to OSD output settings when using peripheral border display. Well, I don't know about you, but that didn't mean much to me when I read it. In fact, it kind of a confusing jumble of words. Checking through the manual, it says, and I quote, when using a display level with peripheral border display, if you set monitoring setup OSD output HDMI to off, the video output from the HDMI out terminal will be displayed in full screen or full resolution. Now, this is another one of those things that I can't say I've ever used or seen in my normal use of the camera, but the short of it is that now when you have a clean HDMI feed with the OSD and everything off so that you can record it on your Ninja Recorder or stream it to a live stream, the camera will now always output at the full resolution, even if you have the internal display level menus, overlays, whatever, set to have the peripheral border turned on so that you could better see the status icons. Now, the other updates to the UI were also relatively minor. To start with, the digital teleconverter icon is now displayed in both the level 1 and level 2 status overlays, and, well, given that the digital teleconverter does reduce image quality, I think it's always a good idea to know when that's active, so this is a good thing and probably something Canon should have implemented when they added the functionality. Second, in the USB modes entry menu, the previously titled PTP connection/GPE2 setting has been renamed to a much more sensible and understandable Canon apps/GPE2. Either way, this is the setting that you would use when using either your GPE2 GPS unit or when connecting to a Canon camera control app on either an Android device or a computer. Finally, for the photo users, over in photo mode, Canon has added protect image and rating during FTP transfers. Oh, and I guess I should round this out with the last major update that the Canon camera has seen, which is support for one or more new lenses that Canon has added in this firmware. Now, the release notes call specifically for the RF mount CN7x17 KAST/R1, also known as the Cineservo 17 to 120mm T2.95 to 3.95 RF lens, and that all of its functionality is supported. Autofocus, all of the distortion or aberration corrections, and the proper reporting of the T number, all of that is now supported. In addition, Canon, or at least Canon USA's page for the R5C states that the firmware also adds support for the RF 70 to 200mm f2.8L IS USM-Z, the RF 24mm f1.4L VCM, and RF 50mm f1.4L VCM lenses. However, they are not mentioned in the release notes. And unfortunately, I don't have either of those lenses, or any of those lenses actually, so I can't verify what the exact situation is. That said, if you do have any of those last 3 RF lenses and you have tried them with the new firmware and they either work or don't work, let us know how that plays out in the comments if that happens to be the case. So those are the changes that Canon has made in this new firmware 1.0.9.1. But I want to take a quick second to touch on one change that the R5C didn't get. On the C400, Canon added the ability to desqueeze 1.5x anamorphic lenses. Now, while it's arguable how relevant anamorphic lenses are in the R5C's market segment, the camera does support desqueezing 1.3, 1.6, and 2x anamorphic ratios. Moreover, at least when I was looking at anamorphic lenses in the past, there were quite a few in the more budget range from, for example, Venus Optics that used this 1.5x ratio. Now, that said, the desqueeze, or lack thereof it, does not affect our recordings. Only the viewfinder or preview image. And of course, if you're using an external monitor that can support these desqueeze ratios, then that's even less of a problem there. But given that the R5C already supports anamorphic desqueeze at other levels, I really do feel like this should have been relatively trivial to add to the camera, and in fact, should have probably made it to all of the firmware updates, with the exception of the XF605 that doesn't support external lenses. Now, to wrap this up, as always, remember this is a Cinema EOS firmware update, and that means you do the update in video mode, and your video mode settings will be reset to the defaults when you install it. Oddly, for some reason, the photo mode settings will stay just fine, but you should probably check anything that's critical to you there. Therefore, Canon and I recommend that you back up your camera settings to an SD card before you install this update. To do this, head over to the System Setup 1 menu and select the Transfer Menu /CP settings, and then save those settings to your SD card. Now, the update also must be installed from an SD card as well, and you can use the same SD card as you use to back up your settings. It doesn't interfere, and that's not a problem. Of course, when the update is complete, use the same Transfer Menu /CP setting to restore your menu and custom picture settings to the camera from the SD card that you backed them up to. Now, that said, I do want to make one word of caution. Some things are not backed up with the camera's menu and custom pictures. Specifically, this includes the custom white balances that you may have set for the A and B custom white balances. If you use those, like I do for the studio setup, then you need to remember to recreate those after you have upgraded your camera and restored your settings. Otherwise, they will be reset to the defaults, which I believe is 5600 Kelvin, and you may end up with the wrong white balance next time you go to use the camera, or you will have to remember, of course, to do this procedure at that point. That said, I hope you found this useful, or at least interesting. If you did, let me know by hitting that like button. Also, if this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you haven't already. Finally, if you'd like to help and support this channel, you can help us for free by liking this video, sharing it with your friends, and leaving a comment with your experiences. Likewise, you can support us by hitting that thanks button or buying yourself something you've always wanted from one of the affiliate links in the description below. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.